Today we're going back to Afghanistan, and we could very well be going back to the 7th century because Holly has a story about the laws and justice in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Tell us a little bit more about what you have found out.
Right. So in my last trip there, one thing that I really wanted to do was to go to the Ministry of Justice and sort of talk to them about when the implementation of these very strict Sharia laws was going to come into play, sort of why they haven't come into play already, and just kind of get a deeper sense of how the Taliban really is reforming the justice system from the previous government, which was also an Islamic government that the US supported, but the Taliban sort of take on it obviously is it's quite different. So I think it's important to instead of sort of conjecturing, to kind of get an understanding, get an on the record understanding too of where they see sort of that future. So I had my fixer, my wonderful Naweed, set up sort of a meeting at the Ministry of Justice with their spokesperson. Um, so after a bit of back and forth, they sort of finally agreed to meet me, and I mean it was very interesting just trying to get into the building. It was a The security guards that were outside, the Taliban security guards, were just absolutely doing everything in their power to not allow me to go in, because it certainly wasn't a place that I think any women, go to anymore. And they were not happy with how I was dressed. Even though it was, my head was covered, my ankles were covered, everything was very covered, but they were still sort of not happy that they could still see my face. So that sort of gives you a bit of an indication of what it can be sometimes like dealing with the Taliban. However, the spokesperson himself, he continued to fight for me to get in, I guess, and argue with these security guards, and said that there wasn't anything wrong necessarily because I was a foreigner. If I was a local Afghan woman, I think it probably would have been very different. I probably would have had to wear a burqa, and even then, I may not have been allowed to enter the building. But because I was a foreigner, they sort of tend to be a little bit more lenient with that. So once that debacle sort of was over, I went into the building, and of course, there were no women there at all. But I sat down and, was greeted, welcomed, and that's another interesting sort of factor about the Taliban is often how softly spoken they are. I think in the West we have this sort of I guess violent image of the Taliban, whereas when you sort of sit with them, it is um, sometimes a little bit jarring because oftentimes they are very sort of demure. They don't speak very loudly, and oftentimes, especially the very religious ones, they won't look at me. So when they're speaking to me, they look at the floor. So that is sort of just an adjustment that has to be made. But in going there, I kind of just wanted to just touch on sort of a variety of topics, and I think it's important in these situations. You're not going to interrogate, you're not going to kind of stick it to them, you're not necessarily going to argue with them, but you should ask the sort of important and tough questions. But let it sort of come from a sort of, I guess, a conversational point of view if you want them to be honest with you back. And that is always the challenging part of being a journalist, is finding that balance.